Hey y'all, it's Pastor Ryan and welcome to Cliff's Notes Confirmation, a little video series intended for those families who are unable to attend our usual confirmation classes and discussions on the first and third Sunday of each month, or for anyone out there who might want to follow along with us through the Hebrew Bible and the Greek books of the Old Testament. Just as a reminder, I try to keep these a little shorter, 20, 30 minutes, which is half the time we would normally have on a Sunday. But this way, hopefully, folks who have to skip a class don't fall too far behind. And of course, the readings are more thoroughly delved into in the Faith 5 readings intended for the devotional homework each week. So, today, we've got two of the big guns in the story of the Hebrew Bible. We're going to be talking about Kings David and Saul. You may remember in recent classes we talked about the Exodus under Moses when God's people Israel, along with a mixed multitude of the faithful, were brought out from slavery in Egypt to freedom in the promised land of their ancestors, the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then once they settled in the land, for a long time they were a loose confederation of 12 tribes claiming descent from the 12 sons of Jacob, also known as Israel. And during this time there was no sort of central administration. They were unified by religion, by faith, by the Ark of the Covenant at Shiloh. And whenever a crisis arose, whenever the people would turn from the law of God and thus fall victim to the nations surrounding Israel, foreign kings would come in and set up shop. God would raise up judges. Judges were special heroes purposely drawn from the most unlikely places and used as sort of channels for God's liberative power, the good news of God's victory and grace. And these judges did not set up dynasties. One of them is his son tried to put himself up as king. It did not end well. Yet as time went on, we came to a very special figure, Samuel, the prophet Samuel, who is known as the last of the judges. And when Samuel was up in years, the people said, you know, your sons are not going to cut it. We want to have a king like the other nations have kings. And we want to do neat stuff like build palaces and have standing armies and go out to war. And Samuel said, God is your king. You don't need a man in charge over you. Don't you know what he's going to do? He's going to tax you. He's going to draft your sons into his army. He's going to conscript your daughters to serve in his palaces and his harems. Having a king is a terrible idea. But the people said, we don't care. We want one. Everybody else has one. And God says to the prophet Samuel, don't worry. They're not rejecting you. They're rejecting me. But if they want a king they shall have. And so Samuel anointed Saul to be the first king of Israel. And where we left off last time, Saul had won a great victory like the judges before him, and all seemed hunky-dory. However, our story picks up in the first book of Samuel, chapter 13, verses 5 through 15. I won't do all the readings here in this video. If you want to follow along at home, be my guest. And like I said, we will also be reading them on a daily basis with the Faith 5 homework. But anyway, in 1 Samuel 13, verses 5 through 15, Saul oversteps his bounds. There is a religious ceremony, and when Samuel doesn't show up, Saul kind of takes upon himself not only the mantle of secular governing leadership, but religious leadership. And that's a big no-no. Because as we will see, for the most part, in the monarchy of Israel, in the kingdom of Israel, there are effectively three branches of government. There's the king, there is the priestly establishment that will be centered in the temple that we'll talk about. It hasn't been built yet. We're getting there. And then there are the prophets, and who, of course, arise from various corners and who speak out for justice and for the oppressed. And so you have sort of the moral authority, the state authority, and the religious authority, the cult of Yahweh, if you will. Because Saul oversteps his bounds as king, and thereby sort of disrespects God, taking upon a holy mantle for himself, which was not granted. Saul is then rejected as king over Israel. His house has failed the test, and Samuel goes off under the guidance of God's Spirit to choose a replacement. And we read about this in 1 Samuel chapter 16, verses 1 through 13. The person that Samuel chooses will be the youngest of many brothers, who is in fact a shepherd, and a rather experienced and tough one, as we shall read. And this youngest child in this tiny kind of podunk city of Bethlehem is named David. Once again, we can see the Hebrew Bible's preference for the younger brother over the elder, which is an inversion, a direct contradiction of the prevailing culture of the ancient Near East, where the elder brother always got the lion's share. So David is still a child, but Samuel anoints him to be Saul's replacement in due time. Okay, now, the next chapter, 1 Samuel 17, we're going to read verses 1 through 10 and 41 through 51. We're hitting the highlights here. This is the story that probably most everyone is best familiar with, which is, of course, David and Goliath. There is a conflict between the people of Israel under King Saul and the Philistines, a very interesting group of people who lived along the shore, the Mediterranean Sea, sort of cutting off the Israelites from the sea. What makes the Philistines so fascinating is that they appear to have been the remnant of the Sea Peoples back in the Bronze Age. There's what's known as the Bronze Age collapse, where something happened up around the area of Greece, probably a vast volcanic eruption that just sent waves and waves of probably Greek people, probably around the aftermath of the Trojan War, and they flooded down throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, and they just knocked over empire after empire after empire until they got to Egypt. And Egypt was the one ancient power that withstood the Sea Peoples and then in fact settled some of them along their borders as to be sort of a thorn in the side of their neighbors. And that's the Philistines. The Philistines are probably Greeks. They're probably the grandchildren of the heroes of the Trojan War, believe it or not. And their biggest champion in the story is a giant named Goliath. Now, giants have shown up before. The usual term for them is Giborim, which means not necessarily like super, super tall, but Superman, superhuman. And depending on whether you're reading the Hebrew version or the Greek version, Goliath is anywhere between 6 and 9 feet tall, which is pretty impressive, given that in the ancient Near East, your average dude was probably like 5'3". So no matter how you cut it, Goliath is a great big dude, wields weapons too large for anyone else to even carry. And when the Israelite army and the Philistine army are lined up opposite each other, Goliath comes out and keeps challenging the Israelites to send out people for one-on-one combat. And this wasn't terribly unusual. There were times when ancient armies would send out champions, and whoever, won at the very least demoralized the enemy army, and sometimes the fight was actually decided by single combat. But you know the deal. David, who is still a young boy, who is still a shepherd, is bringing supplies to his brothers who are in Saul's army. Saul ends up getting to know David in one story because David played the lyre, which is like a harp sort of instrument, and that's the only thing that would soothe the king's aching headaches. It was said he had an evil spirit afflicting him. But really what happens is David, even as a young boy, is disgusted by the fact that no Israelite is brave enough to go out and fight Goliath. So David goes out there, this little boy, up against this great foreign giant, and says, you come to me with your sword and your shield, I come to you with the Lord. And he takes a sling, which is not like, Dennis the Menace. A sling was an established, very deadly weapon of war in the ancient Near East. Get a rock in there with like a leather thong, you spin it really fast, and you can really take people out with it. David says that he used to kill bears and lions who'd come after the sheep. And what he does is he prays to God, has faith, wings that stone, hits Goliath right in the noggin. Goliath goes down. David pulls out Goliath's own sword and cuts off his head. Needless to say, this makes young David a great hero in the eyes of the army, which immediately runs down and routs the Philistines, who are in shock, right, that their giant, their Superman, has been beheaded. Now, this, as you might imagine, leads to David becoming quite the hero as he gets a little older. We read about David the hero in 1 Samuel chapter 18, verses 12 through 16, 20 through 29. Unfortunately, he gets a little too popular. He is loyal to the king Saul, and Saul's daughter and son both think that David is just the bee's knees. But Saul is deeply jealous of him because he's the people's hero now, and Saul has his own basket of problems, and he can't believe that his son Jonathan is buddies with David, because doesn't he understand that if David takes over, Jonathan can't be king? So the direct result of David the hero is David the exile, which we read about in 1 Samuel 20, verses 1 through 4 and verse 17, and then in chapter 24, verses 8 through 11. Basically, David runs away because Saul is trying to kill him, and despite having multiple opportunities to assassinate Saul, David refuses to do so, and says, this should prove my loyalty, right? I had the opportunity to kill the king and take the crown, and I chose not to. Next up, we have a favorite to read around Halloween, and this is the entire chapter of 1 Samuel 28, the Witch of Endor. So there's a big battle coming up, and Saul is nervous. He doesn't know if he's going to win. He doesn't know if God is still on his side. And so he finds a medium, a woman, well, really a necromancer, a woman who can call up the dead. And this is, of course, punishable by death under Israelite law. Black magic, by the way, was also illegal in pagan societies. The Code of Hammurabi, the Qing dynasty in China, the 12 tables of Roman law. Black magic was always punishable by death. It's not just a Judeo-Christian thing. But Saul finds this woman and says, I want you to bring up from the dead Samuel, who obviously has passed on by this point in the narrative. But Saul wants the old prophet to come give him advice. And it's a great story because the shade of Saul comes up from the underworld, the shade of Samuel rather, and looks to Saul and says, what are you doing? I'm not supposed to be here. You violated the laws of God. And because of this and for so many other reasons, God will take the kingship from you and give it to David, who is worthy. And then, surprise, surprise, we go on to 2 Samuel chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, chapter 5, verses 1 through 4 as well. And here we have David and Jonathan. Sadly, Jonathan was a good guy. Good Lord, Saul, King Saul, and his son Jonathan fall in battle. And this grieves David greatly because he was loyal to Saul, even though Saul was nuts. And Jonathan was David's best friend. I mean, he loved that man. Nevertheless, just as Samuel had prophesied when he anointed David in his youth, David is made king over the 12 tribes of Israel. Continuing in 2 Samuel, chapter 5, verses 6 through 10, we read about David and Jerusalem. Okay. Jerusalem, you may remember way back when we talked about Abraham and the priest king Melchizedek of Salem came out to bless Abraham and did all kinds of things that ring bells in our head, making us think of Jesus Christ. Salem was a sacred city. Jerusalem was a sacred city. But when the Israelites had come and occupied the Promised Land, they had never managed to get the Jebusites out of this one city, Jerusalem, because it's up on a series of mountains, and it's well fortified, it's well defended. and they've been there for generations, surrounded by Israelites all around. David manages to take the Jebusite city by sneaking up. The aqueduct isn't really the proper term. See, there was a spring of fresh water that supplied the city, and there was a tunnel that was dug from the city to the well so that they could have water during sieges, when people would attack the city. David figures out where this is, and he climbs up the tunnel, and he comes out in the middle of Jerusalem with his crack troops and manages to take the city with apparently fairly minimum bloodshed. The reason this is important is because King David will make Jerusalem his capital city. It is not part of any of the land belonging to any of the 12 tribes of Israel, and its people do not belong to any of the 12 tribes of Israel. They are Jebusites, as I said, so they are loyal to David alone, and this is kind of brilliant. It's the same basic solution in the United States when the Capitol was built at Washington, D.C. They made certain that that capital city did not belong to any one given state, right? Virginia and Maryland both donated land so that D.C. could be an independent entity and thus be capital to all the states, specifically because it did not belong to any one of them. Same deal with Jerusalem. It doesn't belong to any one of the 12 tribes. Ergo, it is a good place from which the king may rule the 12 tribes. He's centralizing his power, centralizing authority. All right, now we are on to 2 Samuel chapter 11, verses 1 through 5, 14 through 17, and 25 to 27. Or you can just read all of 2 Samuel 11. This is the infamous story of David and Bathsheba. To this point in the narrative, David has been just a stand-up guy. Great kid, war hero, loyal servant of King Saul, and good king who took Jerusalem and ruled. And well, now he's getting on in years, getting a little long in the tooth. His beard's turning white like mine. And it comes spring, the time when kings lead their armies out to battle. All right, that's why the month of March is called March, right? Because the kings go out to battle. And David stays at home. He sends out the army and he delegates. He's old, he's getting kind of lazy, kind of tired. And he starts some trouble because while his army is out, David is in the capital. He looks across the way, looks across the Kidron Valley, and sees a woman bathing on a rooftop. Her name ends up being Bathsheba, and she just captures his heart, or at least his desire. And he brings her to the palace and has his way with her, and lo and behold, she is pregnant with the king's son. Long story short, David arranges for Bathsheba's husband Uriah, who is loyal to David alone. Uriah, it says, is a Hittite. He works for the king directly. He's not one of the 12 tribes. And Uriah is just a great guy, stand-up guy, and David effectively has him whacked so that then David can bring Bathsheba into his house and make her one of his wives, make her queen. And at some point along the line, he promises her that it is her child who will succeed him as king. So David the hero has lived long enough to become David the villain. In 2 Samuel 12, verses 1 through 12, we have this remarkable episode where the prophet Nathan, a friend of David's, comes to David and tells him this story. He says, there's a man who's got a bunch of sheep, and his neighbor is a poor old man who just has a little ewe lamb. And this little lamb, the poor old man loves this little lamb as if it were his child, and it eats with him and he sleeps with it. He just adores it and cares for it. And his rich neighbor, who's got a bunch of sheep, one time has guests over. He doesn't want to kill one of his sheep, so he steals the little ewe lamb, the only lamb that this poor guy has, and serves that to the guest. And Nathan says to King David, what do you think should be the response, the punishment upon the rich man who stole the one beloved lamb from the poor old man? And David says, by God, he deserves to die. You know, he deserves to pay back what has been lost fourfold. And then, of course, Nathan has the hook. He says, you are the man, right? You're the one who stole Uriah's wife and murdered him. You had queens, you had a harem, you had money, you had power, you had everything you could ever want, and you stole his beloved and his life, and you have pronounced the sentence on yourself. You will pay back fourfold. And so as he murdered Uriah, we shall see as the story continues that the violence that David has brought to his house results in 4 of his sons dying either of a bloody death or one from disease. What's amazing about this is David is the great hero. David is the favorite king of the Bible. He's God's the one after God's own heart. Everybody loves David, and yet look how honest the Israelites are about his sins, about his wickedness, about his fall from grace. All these other law codes, you know, there's different rules for the rich and the powerful versus the poor versus the king at the very top. And in the Bible, the king is not above the law. Even King David, even the greatest king, must be called to justice, to truth, to make amends for the horrors he has committed. Hold on, I dropped my paper. All right, so this leads straight into the story of Absalom, the king's rebellious son. He's I believe the firstborn or close to it, and he fully expects to become king, and he's not going to wait for the old man to die. So Absalom effectively starts a rebellion to kick out David. And we can read the story of Prince Absalom's rebellion in 2 Samuel chapter 13, verses 1 to 2, 20 to 22, 28 to 29, chapter 15, verses 13 and 14, and chapter 18, verses 1 through 5, 31 to 33. That's hopping from mountaintop to mountaintop, right? Hitting the highlights. There's this incredible part in the Bible. David is driven out of Jerusalem, but people loyal to him stay behind to serve Absalom and basically be David's spies. And well, when push comes to shove, there's a military conflict, and David just tells his generals, don't kill my son. Don't kill Absalom, right? He may have rebelled against me. He may have driven me from my capital and my palace. But please, he's my boy. Don't kill him. And they do. David's commanders, disobeying his orders, kill Absalom because they know he's just going to be trouble if David lets him live. And there's this just heart-wrenching scene where David is crying out, you know, Absalom, Absalom, my son, wishing that he had died instead of his child. And it's just, on the one hand, it's just haunting, you know, the grief, the pain of it. On the other hand, we remember what David did to Uriah and Bathsheba, and now we see him reaping the fruits of that. It's terrible. Okay, so in 1 Kings chapter 1, verses 5 through 8, verses 28 through 34, and then chapter 2, verses 10 and 11, chapter 3, verses 3 to 15, and chapter 4, verse 29, I just threw in there as the cherry on top. This is the story of Solomon. Solomon is the son of David and Bathsheba. Remember, Bathsheba does not appear to be an Israelite, right? She was probably a Jebusite. Her husband was a Hittite. These are not tribes of Israel. And it seems that that old guard in the city wanted one of their own on the throne, and David told Bathsheba that this could be so. So the son who succeeds David as king is the son of Bathsheba, King Solomon, who will be known as the wisest of all men, the wisest of all kings, which again is ironic because Solomon, like David, will have an amazing youth. Israel will prosper as never before under his reign. If David's reign was all about fighting and war and making the nation secure, Solomon's reign is all about prosperity and trade and wisdom. But just like his father, when Solomon gets old, he makes stupid choices regarding women and wives, of whom he had about 1,000. If I remember correctly, it was 700 wives and 300 concubines who were kind of like half wives. There were differing statuses in marriage in the ancient Near East. But that's the great irony, right? Our greatest king, King David, what a yutz, right? The wisest man ever, King Solomon, what a fool. And this is the delicious honesty and irony of the Hebrew Bible with regard even to their heroes, even to their kings. And then in 1 Kings chapter 8, verses 22 to 30, something very important happens. Solomon, following plans left by his now late father David has passed on, Solomon builds a permanent temple to God in Jerusalem that will house the Ark of the Covenant in a little room called the Holy of Holies that can only be entered one day a year by one man, the high priest. And so as David established Jerusalem as the center of government for the whole country, for all 12 tribes, so Solomon establishes the temple at Jerusalem as the heart of Israelite religion and faith. So you can begin to see now, I hope, why Jerusalem is such an important city in the story of the Bible and ultimately to the story of Jesus Christ. Okay, that was a crash course. Went through 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, and well into 1 Kings, talking about the rise and fall of King David, his predecessor Saul, his successor Solomon. It is indeed one of the greatest stories in all of Christian and Western tradition. And the figure of David especially, Solomon also, will be integral to understandings of Jesus Christ 1,000 years later, because of course Jesus is the heir of those kings, the true king of Israel. All right, that's the long and the short of it. I'll keep this under 30 minutes. If you have stuck around all the way to the end, mazel tov. God bless. Thank you for sitting here and walking through this story with me. Go in peace. Serve the Lord. Thanks be to God.